Catherine, I think you have your camera on. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the impacts and the response to Storm Christophe. My name is Charlie Seward, and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive at Cheshire West and Chester Council. But my main role tonight is to help to make sure that the webcast runs as smoothly as possible, to introduce our presenters and speakers, and most importantly, to put the questions that many of you have raised in the run-up to this event, and may well do so during the course of the event, to our panel, in the hope that we can get answers to as many of those as possible during the course of the next hour and a half or so. It's now nearly 6 weeks since large swathes of the borough suffered the catastrophic consequences of the storm, which left many residents without their homes, businesses unable to function, and caused extensive damage to land and property. And this session is really designed to give you an overview of the event, but hopefully to provide some further clarity about the scale and impact on communities throughout Cheshire West and Chester over the period of the event itself, to explain the immediate response from the council and its partner agencies, to highlight some of the recovery work that's been ongoing over that last 6 weeks, and importantly, to hopefully to start to outline at least some of what will be happening next and what you can expect in terms of engagement with us and how you might be able to access further support and or advice. So in terms of the agenda that we've got for tonight, we're going to have a brief introduction. We're going to hear from Councillor Louise Gittins, who's the leader of the council. And she will be introducing a short video that I think will visually and quite compellingly illustrate the scale and extent of the floods. We'll then have a series of presentations from lead officers and agencies who were involved in the immediate emergency response, who have been involved subsequently in the recovery, and who continue to be involved in the ongoing review, learning lessons and planning for the future, and importantly, in supporting affected residents and businesses. We'll then have hopefully a reasonable amount of time for a question and answer session. And then finally, we'll have some closing remarks from Councillor Karen Shaw, who's the Deputy Leader of the Council, and is also the Cabinet Member with responsibility for flood risk management. The question and answer session itself will cover a number of questions that people have sent in to us. We've received a lot of questions in advance of the session, but as I said, you can still submit questions during the course of the webinar itself. And you can do that either by, I think there should be a button on your webinar page which asks you to submit a question, or you can email directly to flood recovery, all one word, flood recovery at cheshireWestandchester.gov.uk. So that's flood recovery at cheshireWestandchester.gov.uk. I should say at the outset that because of the sheer number of questions that we've had, we may not be able to deal with them all tonight in the question and answer session that we've planned for. But I do absolutely commit to making sure that we follow up and provide answers to every question that's been asked, either before tonight, during the event, or afterwards, as soon as we possibly can. If you are watching the webinar after the event, because we are recording this for that purpose, we will keep the flood recovery email address open and available for another week. and that will give you a chance to raise any further questions or concerns you might have. And again, I'll make sure that we commit to answering all of those as well. This is one of a number of meetings and events that we have held since the floods, and we'll be holding more in coming weeks. And we do want to provide you with assurance that we'll continue to engage with you, both as we seek to put in place immediate measures to support you in getting your homes or your businesses or your properties back up and running, but also as we seek to learn those lessons and put in place measures and actions to address the problem going forward. On a personal note, I can say that I myself have actually been made homeless by Storm Christoph over the last few weeks, and will probably remain so for some months to come. And my wife's business was massively disrupted by the event as well. So I know only too well how devastating this can be for you and your families, and how important it is for you to know and understand that the rest of the world hasn't simply moved on to the next issue and abandoned you. And hopefully tonight's session will give you some reassurance in that respect. So I'm going to hand over now to Councillor Louise Gittins, who's going to officially introduce the event. So Councillor Gittins, welcome.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And a big thank you for everyone who's joining us here tonight, to our panel guests and to everybody who's watching on the webinar. As if we didn't have enough of a challenge dealing with a global pandemic, nature decided to bring havoc to many of our communities in the form of Storm Christoph. This was some of the most serious flooding we have ever experienced in Cheshire West and Chester. First and foremost, on behalf of the Council and our partners, I'd like to express our sincere sympathy to all those affected. For many people, and many of whom will be listening tonight, the impact was and continues to be enormous. People have lost their homes, businesses have been significantly disrupted, and it's our absolute priority to do whatever we can to provide as much support to you all as we possibly can. The prolonged and heavy rainfall and snow resulted in a huge number of calls for help with flooding to roads, businesses and residential properties, and affected a number of areas right across the borough, including Winsford, Northwich, Acton Bridge, Ellesmere Port, Chester and Farndon. Its scale was unprecedented locally and would have been a huge undertaking at the best of times. To have delivered our collective response during the middle of a pandemic was a massive challenge, and I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking everybody who is involved. That includes the wonderful members of our communities who donated their time, resources, food, shelter, warmth and support despite the atrocious conditions. And this was done to help other people during a time of great vulnerability for them. Without that support, we would have found it even more difficult to protect those who needed it. So thank you. It's another example of our communities going above and beyond, as we've seen since the start of the pandemic. I'm extremely proud to represent the people of this borough. There's clearly a really big emotional strain on everyone who's been affected by the floods, but also a considerable financial impact as they look to recover from it. We made that case to government a number of times and are really disappointed that financial assistance from them is extremely unlikely to be forthcoming, but we will continue to lobby them. However, we recognise how important it is that people are supported, so we've set aside a sum of money to help with recovery across the borough. We will also work with residents and businesses to identify additional resources to help fund flood resilience measures and, we hope, mitigate the impact of future flood events, which look likely to be inevitable, globally that is, and not just here in Cheshire. We all need to continue to pull together in times of crisis, and we'll do everything we can as a council and as a partnership to get through this and effectively plan for the future. The council clearly has a key role to play, directly and in terms of coordination, but a range of agencies play an equally key role, and it's good to see so many of them here tonight. We will continue to work together to support everyone affected, keep the lines of communications with residents and businesses open, and learn lessons together over the coming weeks and months. And thank you again for coming along tonight. Before we move into presentations from the lead officers involved in the most recent flood response, we'll now play a short video to illustrate just how challenging these events were. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Gittins, and I think you'll all agree, if you needed reminding, that is that that video really brings home just how devastating this event was, and it only illustrates a tiny proportion of the areas and the properties and the people who were affected by Storm Christoph as it struck the whole of the borough. I'm now going to introduce our main presenters for the evening. So we're going to start off with some presentation from Sean Trainer, who's our Head of Highways and Transport at the Council, and who also has key responsibility as the lead local flood authority officer. And he's joined by Chris Samuel, who's the team manager for the Joint Cheshire Emergency Planning Team. But as Councillor Gittins said, this is very much a collaborative process, and there are many agencies and organisations involved at every stage. So Sean and Chris will be introducing in turn David Brown from the Environment Agency, Samantha Sloan from United Utilities, and Daniel Greenhalgh from the Canal and Rivers Trust. And we'll also be hearing more about some of the support to residents and businesses that we're able to offer and that we're planning for in the future. And we'll hear from Rachel Foster, who's head of our locality services here at the council, and Catherine Walker, who heads up our economic development service. So there is a lot to get to. I'm going to ask the speakers, if possible, to be as succinct as they can, so that we can then move on to questions. But I'll hand over now to Chris and Sean.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you, first of all, about the weather situation that was presented to us as far as Storm Christoph is concerned, some of the key points from that, and then I'll talk a bit about how we responded as a multi-agency partnership to the storm and the flooding that resulted from that. And then we'll all have Sean Traynor and our partners talking to you about what we've been doing since and the next steps. Next slide, please, Rob. So, as in with all severe weather that we are confronted with in the UK, we basically receive flood warnings and severe weather warnings from the Met Office and the Environment Agency ahead of any severe weather incident. So in the case of this flooding for Storm Christoph, we had an amber warning issued by the Met Office in the days leading up to the flooding incident, and that covered, as you can see there, the Greater Manchester, Merseyside and Cheshire area. So this is a normal occurrence, us receiving these warnings ahead of these incidents so that we can get ourselves prepared for the impacts that are coming our way. One of the other things that this triggers is what's called flood advisory teleconferences. They're set up by the Environment Agency, and all the partners gather to basically discuss the forecast and what we're doing to get prepared for the incident. As you can see from the bottom left there, Storm Christoph brought some exceptionally wet weather to the area over that 3-day period, one of the wettest 3-day periods on record. Next slide, please. These tables on this slide show you the rainfall and river levels over that period. So the top table there looks at the Weaver catchment with measurements taken from various sites in that catchment. And as you can see, the third column along gives you the long-term average that the Met Office has for January. The fourth column along looks at the rainfall that came down over that 3-day period, and it shows you in the final column what the percentage of the long-term average is. So as you can see there, for the Cholmondeley and Walston sites in the catchment, our percentages of the long-term average were actually, we received more than the month-long average in that 3-day period. And then again, when you look at river levels in the table below for the Weaver and Dane catchment, you can see in the fourth column along the old maximum recorded levels, and then in the final column, the new maximum levels. So Hayhurst Bridge in in Northwich, as you can see there, it went from 2.8 up to over 3.5 metres for this flood event. Next slide, please. This map here shows you the extent of the flooding across the Cheshire West area. As you can see, it was very extensive. We had flooding taking place over in the west of the borough in places like Williston and Hooton Green, to the south in places like Farndon and Tatton Hall, and then we had flooding over in Winsford, Northwich and Acton Bridge. In total, 15 locations with flooding of properties, both residential and business, right across the borough, all over the same time period. So very challenging for the responding agencies with flooded locations all taking place at the same time. Next slide, please. This slide here gives you another example of some of the river levels that we experienced over the period. As you can see there, the black line shows the highest recorded level previously, and then the blue jagged line shows where we actually got to with the river levels on this occasion. So as you can see there, I mentioned about Hayhurst Bridge being at 3.58, and you can see that in that top diagram. Next slide, please. This then moves over towards the Farndon and Chester area. So the diagram at the top left shows you the Farndon river levels. As you can see, the previous record was just under 9.3 metres, and on this occasion it went to over 9.6, and we had residents evacuated from the floodplain in the Farndon area. The top right-hand picture shows you the Meadows in Chester. Meadows is a floodplain, and it basically it did what it was supposed to do. It flooded, it took the flood waters from the River Dee onto it, as you can see there in this picture, and saved properties along the River Dee there in Chester on that occasion. Next slide, please. These photographs here just show you some of the other flood impacts across the borough. So top left is Hooton Green out in the Ellesmere Port area. And then the other photos show Finchett's Gutter, Parkgate Road and the Diva Link in Chester. Again, just showing you the extent of flooding impacts across the borough over that 3-day period. Next slide, please. So how did we respond as a multi-agency partnership? Well, on the 18th of January, we had a major incident standby declared by Cheshire Police. And on the 20th, that was then raised up to a major incident, the highest alert level here in Cheshire. What does that involve? Well, that involves all those partner agencies that you can see there coming together on the ground to operationally mitigate the impacts from the flooding. Overseeing that is a management group called the Tactical Coordinating Group, again with representatives from all those agencies working together to coordinate the activities on the ground. So the types of things that we were doing on over that period, the flood defences were deployed and operated in Northwich by the Environment Agency. Our highways and street care team were deploying sandbags around the borough. They operated pumps, and our highways team cleared drains and gullies around the borough. Highways also put in road and bridge closures for safety reasons. And our emergency services, as you can see there, were involved in a range of activities from rescuing residents, attending flooded properties, assisting with traffic management, and liaison with our communities and pumping operations. Next slide. We also had the safe evacuation of residents from both Northwich Marina and the Weaver Court Care Village over a number of days, and the transportation of those residents from a wide range of locations as well around the borough to safe accommodation. That was provided in the main using hotels and bed and breakfasts, where we were able to provide hot food, drinks and medication, and updates about what was happening in terms of when those residents would be able to return back to their properties. We also established an evacuee reception centre in Northwich to aid the evacuation of the Weaver Court residents. Next slide. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to hand over to Sean Traynor, who will take you through the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. Just building on the narrative that Chris has outlined there, and I think some of the challenges that Councillor Gittins outlined earlier as well. Just have a quick look at service demand here during that period. So during the week of Storm Christoph, service inquiries in the highways area relating to flooding, gullies and drainage increased by 370% on a typical week. We had 30 emergency road closures introduced, and many of which were on major routes such as the A41 and the A540. And it was further complicated by other weather impacts. So just as indicated on the visual, we went from freezing rain, snowfall, black ice and hoarfrost, in addition to the flood recovery as well. So next slide, please. So just a visual, just to bring that into some sort of concepts of what we deployed out there. Chris mentioned there sandbags through to tractors and pumps, 24-hour working over two or three days and nights there. Temporary road closures, temporary traffic lights where signals were flooded, and we had to get junctions back up working safely again. The tractor units up there on the top right hand side in our farming community were a great assistance to us in the supply chain from the gritting activities. And then just a bit of a note of what was really heartwarming to hear was the thank yous that we did receive, and there's an example of one in Queen Street where I spent much of my time over a couple of days and nights just trying to make sure that the floodwaters didn't reach those properties there. So we're grateful for that communication back to us. In terms of just again some response in action there, just to give you some flavour of what other colleagues across the council undertaken. So some of our street care colleagues in terms of removal from businesses and properties afterwards in terms of tonnage and number of properties that they visited and assisted, and just an indication of just some of those costs just from one service element there that contributed to the bigger sums that were outlined earlier. And then again, you can see in some of the visuals there at the top middle of the screen some of the damage to the Canal and River Trust assets and some of the Environment Agency flood defences as well. And just what really brings it home is the visual of somebody's front room there and the flood waters. And then just a reflection on the right-hand side, I think just an acknowledgement, particularly the work of some of our partners and Northwich Town Council in particular in that area who worked very closely alongside us and were a great assistance to us and our partners. So what have we been doing since? Well, in terms of, we've established a coordination group that's led by the council, and it provides continued support, and as Charlie mentioned earlier, that's still available. We ensured displaced residents had accommodation to return to and to move to. We had extensive clean-up of flood debris and flood waters, as we've visualised there. We've inspected damage to infrastructure, including some historic bridges, footpaths and roads. And then we've reviewed a lot of the responses to learn lessons for the future. That's equally important as well. So next slide, please. I just want to not dwell on this slide, but I think it's useful just to put what the responsibilities under the legal framework are. So the Flood and Water Management Act, its purpose is to provide for better, more comprehensive management of risk business and help safeguard communities ultimately from those sort of unaffordable rises in flooding waters and protection to water supplies. We also have the flood risk regulations, which require us, the council, as the lead local authority, to have certain provisions in place and duties in terms of flood risk assessments, flood hazard and risk maps, and flood risk management plans. Councillor Gittins mentioned earlier, and I think it is important to recognise that serious flooding can happen at any time, and clearly a lot of the people who are witnessing this webinar have first-hand experience of that. Climate projections, unfortunately, suggest that extreme weather will happen more frequently in the future, and that, again, this stresses the importance of the Climate Emergency Action Plan that the Council recently approved to enact. And then ultimately, the Act does it, the 2010 Act does aim to reduce the flood risk associated with extreme weather, and there's a link to some guidance for asset owners and local authorities to follow that. Next slide, please. So we often hear of what is a Section 19 flood investigation report. These often follow from these events. So I just wanted to briefly outline what the criteria and remit is, because it simply wouldn't be practical or possible to investigate every reported incident. So we do instigate Section 19 reports on a criteria basis. So they will be instigated and already have been, and I'll give you some details of those shortly, where internal flooding has been caused to a property that's used for residential or commercial purposes, resulted in major disruption to the flow of traffic, posed or could have posed a risk to human health, adversely affected the function of critical infrastructure, or caused harmful impacts to environmentally or socially important assets. And again, just to clarify what the purpose of these investigations are, is to investigate what, when, why and how the incident took place. And it acts as a means of identifying future potential recommendations for actions to minimise flood risk or prevent it in future. So these investigations, or these Section 19 reports that you'll hear mention of, they do also outline recommendations and actions that various organisations can do to minimise flood risk in affected areas. So when we look at the impacts of Storm Christoph and the wide-ranging impacts across the borough, and this isn't a definitive list, but this at the moment, this is the list of those areas of the borough that meet the criteria they've outlined. So you can tell there's at least 15 areas, and within those areas there are quite generic bands. There's sort of various multiple subset areas of those as well, and this just gives you an indication of the build-up of those properties that suffered internal, external flooding and the highway areas as well. So I mentioned the process has already commenced, and I'm sure you're eager to learn and hear about what is the duration of that process. So what we have done is commission resourcing already. We know the importance of getting through this thoroughly, but also expediently. So the interim report across those 15 sites will be available within 3 to 4 months. And affected businesses and properties will inform that process. You will make important contributions with regular updates provided by the council. And we do recognise there are many other places outside of those 15 that suffered excess water, and we will consider those as part of routine service operations as well. So next slide, please. So again, I mentioned what's the next step. Certainly for my service area, well, we've commenced the investigations. I think the visual on the left-hand side is Hooton Green. Just shows you some of the activities, survey activities that have been deployed already. We've commissioned in additional resources to expedite the process, and we've already commenced the liaison meetings with the other risk management authorities, many of which are along tonight to assist the process. We're all ready and willing to engage with local communities and business groups, MPs, elected members, town and parish councils, and anybody else who's interested to reduce flood risk. Residents already on the ground in areas like Hooton Green and Northwich and other areas are providing really valuable historic and local knowledge, which will speed that investigation process up. We don't know all the information out there, so please do come forward and continue to play your part. Keep abreast of the latest news and information via the council website and social media channels as well. So next slide, please. I'll just invite a colleague, David Brown, from the Environment Agency, just to introduce their organisation. David, can I just welcome you in?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So yeah, I'm David Brown, Senior Flood Risk Advisor at the Environment Agency, and with me as well from the agency, we've got Claire Nichols, Flood Resilience Advisor, and Deborah Thompson, who's a Recovery Manager. So in the interest of time, and Sean and Chris have covered a lot of it already, I won't repeat what's been said, but just to highlight that effectively during the event, Storm Christoph brought a sort of area-wide event, and the Environment Agency from our office covers Greater Manchester, Merseyside and Cheshire. And we did have an area-wide event with flooding in Warrington, St Helens, evacuations in Didsbury, as well as what you've seen across the Cheshire area. So as part of the preparation, we checked all our assets, made sure that we had pumps available, cleared debris screens, worked with professional partners, for example in Northwich, to get contingencies in place for overpumping both surface water and the foul and surface water risk. And during Christoph across the area, we issued 55 flood warnings and 5 severe flood warnings. For the Cheshire area, that equates to flood alerts across the Dee, Weave and Gowie, with issuing 10 flood warnings and a severe flood warning at Farndon on the Dee. During the event, we part of that multi-agency response in the major incidents, and with the multi-agency response via the tactical coordination groups, all 3 phases of Northwich were deployed. And as the event unfolded, we worked in partnership with the other RMAs to try and look at what we could do to prevent the unfolding situation as things transpired. And during COVID, it's already been mentioned by Councillor Gittins that it was made all the more difficult for us not being in our normal control rooms and flood rooms to coordinate some of that activity. Following the event, we're in recovery mode still, with the area-wide recovery being managed by Deborah Thompson. And following the event, we had community information officers out on the ground, checking on the flood mechanisms, confirming flood routes, helping signpost people to recovery, helping with any kind of questions they had, including the use of New Ground to help with community liaison, and signposting people to the Flood Hub, which is full of valuable resources. And we provide information to anyone and everyone. Been out checking assets, repairing assets to make sure they're fit for purpose in preparation for the next event. And finally, we're working with partner organisations to understand what happened so that we can do what we need to do in the short term to provide contingency and reassurance. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Thanks for that. And I'll just invite Samantha Sloan along from United Utilities. Evening, Samantha.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
We can,
yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. And thank you everybody for your time this evening. I'm Sam Sloan, I'm the Cheshire Drainage Area for United Utilities. And United Utilities are really responsible for the sewer infrastructure in the area, which includes the sewers, the pumping stations, our overflows, and our responsibility really includes the improvement, the maintenance and the extension of those assets. Now, similar to Dave, I'll not go into too much detail, but I just want to try and summarise what we've done in the run-up to the events and also kind of during and post-event. So in the run-up to Storm Christoph, we worked quite closely with the other authorities, really to try and share as much information as possible and prepare where we could, ensure there was as many resources we could get out as possible. Like Dave says, it's been difficult with COVID, but we managed to maximise as many field teams and pulling on support from the outside areas. We also made quite big preparations in terms of our critical sites. So for some of our key sites, we had 24/7 operational support on there, and we put in forward incident control in key locations across the Cheshire area. In terms of our central response, so we've got central alarm management teams, and they were all briefed in advance on the incoming event and crucially the vulnerable locations. So where should they be keeping a real close eye on to be able to prioritise our resources and our units. We checked key assets were all operating as they should and making sure that they were operating at an optimum level. And also we secured additional pumps to really provide extra resilience. So for example, the Dock Road pumping station brought in additional pumps to give that extra resilience for our telemetry and control systems, because that's quite a critical station for us. In addition to that, reviewed all of our asset outages and prioritised those sites that were most likely to be affected by flooding. During the event then, moving on to kind of in the midst of it, we actually experienced kind of the highest volumes of jobs that we've had on record, and that's across the region. So our region covers everywhere from Crewe up to Carlisle, and we actually had a peak of around 1,450 events. So quite a high volume for us, but throughout the event we still managed to continue to assess the asset performance within the Cheshire area and continue to ensure that our sites remained operational despite river inundation. And we've done that through continued monitoring of the alarms and mobilising resources and tankers where needed, just to make sure that our sites continue to pump that flow. We also secured additional pumps to alleviate flooding. So for example, at Waitrose in the town centre, Northwich town centre. And then kind of post-event, we secured numerous vehicles to facilitate the clean-up of silt in key areas throughout Cheshire as well. So in terms of what we've done since then, it's been a very busy period for all of the authorities involved. We've carried out quite detailed flood impact assessments. So we've had a number of teams out really trying to understand the full impact of the event, because that really helps us in terms of understanding the root cause. Once we get that full impact assessment done, carried out a series of asset inspections and maintenance, and also what we've done is completed some hydraulic modelling analysis, and that's for us to better understand that flooding mechanism, like I said. Specifically in the Northwich Town Centre, we've done a full review of all our powered assets upstream as well to make sure that they're all back in their optimum condition. And then when we look forward in terms of what we're doing next, these systems are quite complex because of the integrated nature. So our plan is to work closely with the other risk management authorities as part of the Section 19 process to determine that true mechanism of flooding and work towards an integrated solution to try and protect our customers from the, as we said, the extreme storm events and the elevated river levels. Okay, thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. Much appreciated. And then can I bring Daniel in from the Canal and River Trust, please? Evening, Daniel.
Okay, yeah, I'm here, Sean. So thanks for that, and thanks for the opportunity to join the webinar. I'm Daniel Greenhalgh. I'm Director for the Northwest at Canal and River Trust. And Canal and River Trust, the charity that are responsible for the River Weaver navigation, the Shropshire Union Canal, and the Trent and Mersey Canal in the Cheshire region. And in terms of our response to Storm Christoph, we were responding across the whole of the Northwest. It was most acutely felt in the Cheshire region, but we were also responding significantly in Greater Manchester, in Cheshire, and in North Derbyshire too. Our operations teams were very busy preceding the event, during the event, and after. sluicing water, clearing debris from weirs and locks, and making sure that water management through our navigations was going to convey well. That was mainly focused around the Trent and Mersey, the Shropshire Union Canal and the River Weaver navigation. We actually had to close the River Weaver navigation prior to the storm event, and that was closed to boat movement. The week prior to Storm Christoph, we'd already experienced high volumes of water in the catchment. My engineering and operations colleagues were involved throughout in terms of the response with the tactical coordinating group, working with all partners throughout the event, sort of updating each other, working collaboratively, ensuring everything was being done. We shared data from our river level sensors with partners, and in particular with the Environment Agency. And this is something that we'd actually set up prior to this event, as we have regular conversations and discussions. And we've now got a system in place where we actually share our live data in terms of our river level sensors with the Environment Agency. Our engineers were out busy inspecting assets, and we advised for the closure of the road bridges due to concerns for safety due to the flood damage. And the damage to the truss assets from Storm Christoph was significant. Anderton Boat Lift was flooded. We had damage to our pumps and the hydraulic, mechanical and electrical systems. We suffered a breach on the Shropshire Union Canal just north of Beeston. We suffered a serious landslip on the Trent and Mersey Canal near to Anderton. And on the River Weaver navigation itself, nearly all of our mechanical and electrical assets were affected. We've already undertaken and completed a lot of emergency repairs and inspections. Other repairs are ongoing, and particularly projects to repair the breach site on the Shropshire Union and the landslip on the Trent and Mersey are underway. And the approximate cost to the Trust of Storm Christoph is somewhere in the region of 3 to 4 million on initial estimates, but it could be significantly higher than that. We've engaged with the Strategic Recovery Coordinating Group. We found that to be a real collaborative and multi-agency approach, and we've got the multi-agency debrief next week and the internal debrief ongoing. We've met with lots of local residents, jointly with partners, we've engaged with stakeholders, Cheshire West and Cheshire and the Environment Agency, and we'll continue to be in dialogue with all partners. So thank you, Sean, back to you.
Many thanks, Danny, and many thanks, partners. Charlie, can I hand back to you at this stage to introduce the next section? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you to our partners from EA and UU and the Canal and Rivers Trust as well. Now, just before we move into the questions and answers, we thought it would be really helpful for us to just explain to you what the work that the Council's been doing with its partners, with local communities, with residents and also with businesses, and also sort of give you an indication of what you can expect in terms of support going forward from tonight. So I'm going to hand over now to Rachel Foster and Catherine Walker, who are going to give you an overview of what's on offer from us.
Thank you, Charlie. My name's Rachel Foster. I work for Communities and Culture Service in Cheshire West and Chester. I think it's been really interesting tonight to hear the collaboration and partnership across agencies in terms of the response to the incident to Storm Christoph. I want to reflect on the community's response and how people came together at a significant time of challenge. I suppose the information shared so far this evening does show that this significant incident was on an unprecedented scale in Cheshire West. And I have to say the response from our communities was also on an unprecedented scale. The response of residents, businesses, councillors, MPs, town and parish councils and community and voluntary organisations has been positively overwhelming. In many cases, local ward councillors and town and parish councils were some of the first, or indeed the first, representatives on the scene and critical to the immediate support offered to residents and businesses. And I saw that firsthand at Weaverham and Acton Bridge, with councillors playing a pivotal role in supporting our communities. And our councillors and town and parish councils will play a critical role in enabling ongoing support in their communities as well. and we're really grateful for that. As we've mentioned earlier, more than 130 people in the end, I think, were evacuated. In addition to that, there were some pets that were also evacuated, and we accommodated a number of residents across 6 locations across the borough. That includes local hotels, Forest Hills and Frodsham, as well as local travel lodges, Premier Inns and guest houses. In addition to the evacuation reception centre that was set up in Northwich by our partners in Brio Leisure. So to everybody who contributed to that initial immediate response, we are very grateful. In addition, many residents were supported by friends, family and neighbours to access alternative accommodation and support. And as this was also during the pandemic, the generosity of communities to help each other is even more commendable. There are many examples of residents, businesses and voluntary organisations supporting each other to save assets, to reduce impact on properties and support each other both physically and emotionally. I want to thank everybody who supported each other at such a challenging time. I think the support from our voluntary community sector and our businesses has been incredible. Food and emergency supplies offers were received from many businesses. They were both national supermarkets and food chains, local shops, cafes and food providers, and many stepped in with volunteer support. Certainly not an exhaustive list, and I'd hate to leave people out, but I think just a mention of a couple of groups across the borough, including Blake and Action Team, the Crossroads Community Hub, Helping Hands in Northwich, Soul Kitchen and Cheshire Food Hub, offered and provided food parcels, hot meals, pharmacy deliveries and essential supplies to those who required it, and in some cases provided that support for some time after the initial incident. Those displaced into temporary accommodation were kept in regular contact by council officers, regularly checking in to ensure any support needs were being met, and that those who required additional support were able to be signposted to our colleagues in housing team, who enabled residents to access appropriate accommodation after that initial crisis response. Referrals were also made to the council's welfare assistance programme, which is called the HELP scheme. That just enables us to signpost people to support where wider support services are available, particularly around financial vulnerability. So to our colleagues in those services, they were incredibly helpful at a really challenging time for many residents and businesses. And we deployed teams across the borough. The colleagues from our communities and libraries team were deployed initially in the initial response to support those of areas affected, to contact as many residents as businesses as possible, and to get out onto the ground to see people and offer support where it was necessary, and also to mobilise additional support from colleagues and partners where it was appropriate. And in many cases, the team have continued to visit affected areas to identify any remaining support needs and to escalate where necessary. I think we've just got a couple of reflections on here, some support that was offered from the Cheshire Food Hub and from Crossroads Community Hub supporting residents for the duration of the incident. So next slide, please. In addition, since the initial incident, we have maintained contact wherever possible with residents and businesses. We've posted, emailed or hand delivered in excess of 400 letters to those affected, whose details we have and continue to add to our database. And that contact is, has been to update people on key contacts, key support avenues, but also to reassure communities and businesses that they will be invited to contribute to a review of our response and those formal investigations that will take place as outlined by Sean. Through our communities team, we continue to liaise with councillors, town and parish councils and voluntary organisations to capture any actions and deliver any actions and feedback on any ongoing issues to colleagues and partners. And given the scale of the incident across communities in Cheshire West, I'm sure we can learn from the storm response and ensure we have the appropriate mechanisms to support across all agencies should another incident on this scale occur again. We are clear that some areas and communities will feel that improvements in our response can and should be made, and we will ensure that the information or feedback we have captured to date is included in the review of the response and in contributing to the formal flood investigation where appropriate. We would welcome any comments and feedback from residents across the borough on how we can support recovery to Storm Christoph and how we can support incidents on this scale in the future. So I've got the email address, the flood recovery email address on the slide there, and we really would welcome your feedback, and we are really committed to responding to you appropriately and sharing that information more widely for all residents and businesses that have been affected. So I would welcome your input. Pass over to Catherine.
Hi, good evening. I'm from Economic Development and we deliver the Council's business support service. You've heard this evening from colleagues and just from Rachel in terms of some of the impact, so I'll keep this quite brief. For the flood events, we worked alongside the communities team and of course the localities officers so that we could be as responsive as possible. We know that around 90 businesses were affected across the borough in places including Chester, Tattenhall, Hooton, but with the epicentre for business impact in Northwich. So we worked with our key partners, including organisations such as the Business Improvement Districts, the Town Councils, the Chambers of Commerce, for example, so that we could visit and call businesses, gain insights as to what support was needed in real time, and to allow us to be able to cascade information very, very quickly. We deployed a business support team member to the town during and after the floods, working alongside communities and localities so that we could provide support with practical elements such as clean up, getting pumps, jet washing, requesting support and logging issues with both partner agencies that you've heard from this evening and of course our colleagues across different departments. We ensured that our websites and our mobile support was in place for the full weekend, but that the website had the information, sufficient information, so businesses knew who to contact and what part of support that they would offer in the response to save people calling around multiple agencies. We visited and or called all 90 businesses. Not all could be reached, it had to be said, because many, due to the COVID pandemic, weren't in the premises at the time. But much of the business support work came after the floods. Once the flood water had subsided, the ongoing business engagement was absolutely key. And through this, we were able to identify where problems were still occurring. And we started speaking to businesses to get that real-time picture and a practical picture of the support that would be needed immediately and in the weeks that have since passed. As you heard from the leader of the council at the start of the meeting, it was a priority to lobby government to try and get support for businesses who had lost stock, had damaged equipment and fixtures and fittings. This is ongoing, but appears obviously not to be forthcoming, as you heard. So in response, we've worked with the LEP, the Local Enterprise Partnership for Cheshire and Warrington, to develop a response fund for businesses. It allows us to be able to make a grant contribution towards the replacement of essential capital items. We also know that it's important for businesses to understand what happened, the solutions that are going to be in place and the ongoing support that's available to them. So since the floods, we've also held 2 events with BID members, the Business Improvement District members, including a multi-agency meeting just last week. We do, as you've heard from Rachel, continue to offer support, and our team is there to help, no matter what information you need, whether it's just advice and guidance or access to finance or whatever it might be. We are here to work with the business community to help build resilience, get those who can open as quickly as possible, and those who can't just yet absolutely ready to do so when the restrictions are eased and are able to do so. We do welcome your ongoing feedback, and you can contact us through the email address that Rachel outlined earlier. Thank you. I'll hand back to Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Rachel. I'll just be brief on this slide, albeit it is important, and I'm sure many of these will feature in the question and answer session that Charlie's going to feature shortly. But I think it's important you'll want to know the next steps. And just before I go on to some of the contents on the screen here, I think just hearing some of that narrative there is really, for me, I think we do need to, one of the steps that we've taken there, but we do really need to recognise that strength of local communities, businesses and residents. And also that those supply chains that without which, and I mentioned one of the ones that I experienced and benefited from earlier, the local farmers who provided multiple tractors, pumping units throughout the days and nights. Without those, in those sorts of adverse situations, the situation would have been far worse. So I think we do need to formally recognise those efforts. But in terms of the next step, well, we've mentioned further investigation. And we want the communities and businesses to participate in that process. You'll give valuable information and help us find the solutions that you all look for. Short-term actions, we do need to conduct some immediate actions to give you reassurance. as far as possible. We need to identify actions and funding to mitigate flooding issues in the future, and we won't give up on trying to secure that important funding, and I know that colleagues won't either. We need to explore other ways of supporting businesses and communities to become more resilient to flooding. I've mentioned that extreme events will happen in the future, and we can all help to minimise the impact of that. We want to continue to work with all the partner organisations, many of whom are along tonight, and lots of others as well, who can play an important role here. And then we will commit to providing regular communication updates on progress, as I'm sure partners will as well. So, Charlie, at that point, can I hand back to you, please?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you for everyone who's presented. I'm sure everyone's been very patient. You've heard a lot in the last hour about what has happened, as well as some sort of indication of the work we've been doing since, and in particular then from Sean, the next steps. I think it is a real testament to the community in Cheshire West, that huge amount of voluntary sector resource and energy and effort that was put in to support the bigger agencies in their response, and that's absolutely fantastic. I've had a couple of comments fed back that perhaps people are having a little difficulty with viewing the slides. Maybe some of them are a bit blurred. What we will do is commit to making all of the slides from tonight's presentation available via our online link after the event, so you will be able to see them hopefully clearly if you want to go back and reflect on what you've heard. We do want to now move on to the question and answer session, and I'm going to ask those members of the panel, those people who've been presenting, if they'd like to switch on their cameras so that we can see you, and we will go through as many of the questions as we possibly can that you've asked. There have been a huge number received. If you don't recognise something as your specific question, it may be because we've tried to précis it or put it together with others so that we can get the best possible response that we can from our panel. And just to remind you again, if you want to ask any further questions, either tonight or subsequently, you can go directly through our flood recovery at cheshirewestandchester.gov UK email, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. So I'm going to start with a question here from a resident in Northwich, and I think this may be one for Sean. They say we've now been affected twice by the floodings in the Northwich area, and that certainly won't be unique to them. In October 2019, and obviously latterly in January 21. And they asked that if it comes to light that Cheshire West are at fault, will we be able to press them for compensation for the loss of their car, or for that, not say any other sort of property that was flooded and written off by their insurers? We've also lost our full no claims bonus, even though they were not at fault. So a sort of general questionnaire about claims for compensation, particularly given the insurance challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And I think the first point that's important to state, and genuinely we are sorry to hear of those people that have suffered from the two separate flooding events in Northwich in particular. And I think just touching on the causation, well, the Section 19 investigation report, and it's important to make a distinction here. We have one from the October 2019 event that will be coming to Cabinet for a full investigation report for adoption on the March the 17th. So that will become public imminently. And that will identify the flooding mechanisms. And although the remit of those Section 19 reports isn't to sort of identify fault, and it's more the flooding mechanism and the flood risk reduction, we will be obviously publishing the October 2019 one. Will commence a new Section 19 investigation for the January 21 incident as well, and those will be fully published. But we also set out on the Council's website how highways insurance claims can be made, and we'll post that hyperlink to the page as part of the papers, Charlie.
Thank you, Sean. So yeah, if we can provide that information, I think that'll be relevant to a number of people who've been affected by this particular set of circumstances. I've got one now, probably might be one for Canal and Rivers Trust actually, from a resident in Acton Bridge. who says that it's their belief, and this is again something which we've had a lot of feedback on, that sluices at Dutton Locks should be fully open to reduce the risk of flooding. So were these sluices actually fully opened at the time of this event? Daniel, I wonder whether you could respond to that.
Yes, Charlie. So yeah, thanks for the question. So in terms of sluices on the River Weaver navigation, there is a number of individual sluice sites up and down the navigation, and these sluices are to manage water for navigation purposes, and they're there to maintain safe levels for boats to be able to navigate between the lock structures. So before, during and after the event, all available sluices were operated and they were fully open during the event. And obviously, we as I described before, we're still sort of reacting to the damage and reviewing the impacts to the trust. We've got the multi-agency debrief next week where we'll be able to talk about this in more detail with other partners, and obviously the detail of this will come out in the Section 19 report that Sean's detailed will follow this event. So our initial assessment was all available sluices operated fully.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for clarifying that. And we've had a number of other questions actually that are kind of related to the River Weaver, and particularly in respect of dredging or changes to the whole regime around dredging. This may be one for Sean or possibly the Environment Agency actually to pick up, but we've been asked really whether the cessation of dredging on the River Weaver led to a reduction in the capacity of the river to allow greater flow of water throughout its length from Winnington to the Manchester Ship Canal. And we've had some other questions tonight that are similar in respect of the old river and a number of other parts of the system, which traditionally in the past may have been regularly dredged, but where there's a view that perhaps that those regimes are no longer in place. And in fact, it isn't always clear whose responsibility it may even be to undertake that kind of work. I wonder if either David or Sean could help to clarify that.
Yeah, Charlie, I think David's volunteered to come in on this. Thanks, David.
Yeah, no problem. So when we looked at options for protecting Northwich, we did look quite closely at the structures that are there that Daniel's just outlined, the structures there that effectively divide the river up into a series of ponds with the assets in each place influencing the water level upstream. One of the things that we looked at is, what influence that has on water levels at high flows, and also understanding that the Canal and River Trust have to have an Act of Parliament to effectively look at the navigation, which is something they're obliged to do, and how they control that. So effectively we looked at those operations, looked at how we could modify them potentially to actually reduce the flood risk. And what you tend to find is that at the upper end of the higher flows, the actual structures themselves tend to have less influence, depending on where they are. Some structures pass the whole flow, and some have a series of sluices and then side weirs, so they're kind of fixed assets. So it does depend on which structures we're talking about, but effectively it's the structures that influence the levels more than the actual level of the riverbed, the dredging, if you like. And part of the scenario was to look at the levels within the channel, to look at what the Canal and Rivers Trust dredged to, and to see whether any changes to that would actually make a difference. And we found that it just wasn't significant in terms of the high flow events that we're seeing. So effectively, we're not seeing that as a causation. And effectively, yeah, we look at how the Canal and Rivers Trust operate those assets for navigation and reasonably allow for that, and then look at the residual risk and plan accordingly for that.
So this is an issue that obviously you've looked into, it's to some depth, and you'll continue to review, presumably, as we learn from our experience of these events.
Absolutely. And in fact, just building on that, we did look at scenarios, for example, where, say, navigation was ceased. I'm not suggesting it would be, but because the Canal and Rivers Trust obviously have to dredge for navigation purposes, and Daniel might want to add something there. But we did look at, how that would influence potential water levels upstream in relation to the higher flow events, and we didn't find it to be significant compared to the other things that are more significant, such as, you know, the level of flows, the amount of water we're talking about that has to pass down the navigation.
Okay, thank you, David. We've talked tonight a lot about how this is a kind of multi-agency approach that we're taking, and it really does depend upon really strong partnership between organisations. And there's a question here from a resident in Weaverham asking about who kind of leads that. So it says, will someone take responsibility for ensuring that a coordinated plan is formulated to ensure that all the partner organisations communicate with each other and take appropriate action when there is flooding or floodwater threatens our homes? Sean, is that something you want to pick up to start with, at least?
Yeah, I'll start and then invite Chris, if I may, just to supplement, please, Charlie. So I think there's two roles here. I think from my perspective, the council is the designated lead local flood authority, and so it does have such a function. But I'd also invite my colleague Chris in just to explain the role of the council multi-agency flood response plan as well, Chris, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So yes, so we do have a multi-agency flood response plan for the Cheshire West area, and that sets out how all the partner agencies will work together to respond to any flood incident across the West Cheshire area. As Sean mentions, we're the lead local flood authority, so we coordinate that. And during an incident, all the agencies that you've heard us talk about tonight, and those that are represented on the call, we discuss the strategy and tactics for managing the flood situation via those groups that you've heard tonight. So the tactical coordinating group and the strategic coordinating group where appropriate. So that plan exists, and as you've heard, we're always talking to each other and liaising on how to manage the situation. And that all stems from that multi-agency flood response plan.
Okay, thank you both for that. We've had a specific question that's come in actually during the presentations. It's probably one for Sean again, I'm afraid, because I think this relates to one of the slides that you shared. It says that how come in the section 19 site list it says that Acton Bridge and Weaverham had no properties that had internal or external flooding, and there were only highways incidents? There were at least 12 properties that were evacuated from their homes and a number who further had substantial flood damage. Could we please review and correct this?
Yeah.
Can we give some assurance about that?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and apologies for that. It's not a zero, it's just an omission on the data on that line. So there were many properties affected in Acton Bridge and Weaverham, which we're fully aware of, and we'll correct that slide in the final when this is distributed. Yeah.
Good. That's really important to give people the confidence that we are genuinely going to include them in that process. I've got one here that it may be one for Rachel, and you touched on this a little earlier, but there's a question about whether this is from a landlord in Ellesmere Port. Is there any compensation scheme for damage to people's belongings? And Rachel, I come to you partly because you mentioned the help discretionary scheme earlier in your presentation, and I wondered whether you could both give an indication around the available compensation, if there is any, for compensation for damaged belongings, but also whether you could perhaps just explain a little bit more about the help scheme and how people could access that if they need to.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlie, of course. Unfortunately, there is no specific pot of funding available to compensate people for loss of belongings, which I appreciate is incredibly challenging. This would normally be dealt with by insurers. However, we do appreciate that some homeowners do not have insurance, or in some cases where they have insurance, flood damage is excluded. So there isn't currently a compensation scheme available. We do, however, through local authority, have our help discretionary scheme, and that is a scheme that offers welfare assistance to those on lower incomes or those who require support in an emergency or crisis. The scheme has limited funding, but it is available to people who may be having some financial challenges and may be considered appropriate to apply to the fund. Each applicant is considered individually on their individual situation, but we would encourage anyone who thinks that they may be eligible to visit our help scheme on our webpage, and we can circulate the link with the appropriate documents from this evening. Or there's a helpline number that people can call as well, or come straight through to our contact centre and they'll be signposted to the help scheme. I think also though, Charlie, in addition, then I am aware of some community and voluntary sector organisations that can potentially provide support with reconditioned furniture and essential equipment. And again, we can provide further information dependent on the location of the residence if anyone contacts us through our email address or our contact centre. But more details of local support organisations are also available on Live Well Cheshire West. So I know there is a whole array of organisations across the borough who can support potentially with furniture, with white goods, etc. So if the help scheme isn't appropriate for an individual, there are other channels available.
Thanks, Rachel. So I think, yes, the more information we can get up on our website, and the easier it is for people to access that, the better in this situation. But it's really helpful to at least understand what might be out there and what might be available. I've got a question that sort of follows on from that, really, that maybe Chris, you might want to pick up about it says the deadline for the property flood resilience grants made available for the October-November 19 floods has been extended to the 31st of December this year. For properties flooded in 2019 and again in 2021, are they able to apply for these grants, and how would they do that?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So as has been mentioned previously in this evening, the grants, the flood grant schemes that are available from government, we were unfortunately not able to get those activated for our borough, and that was the same in 2019 as well. So they're not currently available. But if in the future those opportunities do open up to us, we'll basically make sure that our residents are fully briefed and communicated on those, and offer support through the process in terms of how you would make an application. But unfortunately at this time they're not available to us.
Okay, thank you. So we will, of course, keep people posted if there are funds either nationally or that we develop locally.
Yeah.
I've got a specific question here, but I think it's one which may become more and more salient as the impacts of climate change start to really bite. And it's from a resident in Ashton Hayes, and it says for many years, home insurance companies, ours included, we recently discovered, choose to differentiate between flooding and a rise in the water table. Do insurance companies take guidance from informed sources such as the Environment Agency when deciding how to help or not its policyholders? Are we able to, David, are you able to provide any, shed some light on that, if possible?
I'll try and shed some light. I know that insurance companies operate their own risk matrix and their own risk map. So we have our flood risk maps that we publish, but they know they operate their own. I think the specific question relates to specifically groundwater flooding, in fact. So it may be something to do with the small print in the insurance, unfortunately, in relation to this. But broadly, you can get flooding unfortunately from any source, from surface water, groundwater, from main river, from tidal. Groundwater flooding is effectively, when the water table can rise. And what we saw over Storm Christoph was literally, all over the borough, water coming out at ground level, coming out of fields, coming out in places where it wouldn't normally, and then it's normally recedes. So that is something you'd expect it to be high following the event. We know that the ground was saturated, and we know it will remain high for some time. It probably has receded to a small degree. A general rise in the water table, to me, is something slightly different, but unfortunately I think it might come down to the wording of that insurance document, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. But I know that is something that we get more and more inquiries about, because I do think insurers are making that distinction, which may become problematic for people in the future. I've got one now from a resident in Christleton. It says that in other areas there are local flood wardens, each community supported by a group of volunteers with area responsibilities. The volunteers walk the ditches and roads to ensure that farmers are keeping ditches clear and that the local authority are keeping their drains clear. Is this something that town and parish councils or community groups could help out with, perhaps supported by Cheshire West and Chester? I wonder if I could ask Councillor Gittins whether she'd like to respond to that.
Thanks, Charlie. I actually think that's a fantastic idea. We've got a big network of community champions who are supporting us through the pandemic, and I think this is something that we could perhaps speak to our town and parish councils about. We've got a webinar with them tomorrow, so it could be something that we suggest, but I think it's a really good idea, and I don't know how we take it forward, but I think it's something I'd really like to look into.
Excellent. So a commitment there to definitely take that up as an idea. Rachel?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Charlie and Councillor Gittins. The town and parish councils obviously play a key role in assisting with response of these type of events. And I know that some town and parish councils have community emergency plans, which sets out roles and expectations, and flood champions could potentially form part of those plans. And I know Chris and his team are happy to engage and work with town and parish councils to develop community emergency plans. So we could maybe factor that into those considerations as a way to take that forward.
So there's a whole lot of work we can do working with local communities, with parish and town councils, to really understand how people on the ground can do more to help themselves, help their communities, and help us in the process in terms of preventing and managing these events. So fantastic, and we will do whatever we can to make sure that we get that advice out there, and we want to have a really good conversation about how we might shape that as well. I've got a question here about kind of longer term thinking, really, and I don't know whether, I think Gemma Davis may be available to take this one, because I don't think any of the other panel members necessarily have responsibility for this area, but it's about planning. And the question is from one of our residents who says, why are we continuing to authorise building on floodplains? Northwich, for example, had a record of flooding this year. Was that because the floodplain couldn't do its job properly? And could that be due to the amount of building that has been on the Dane Valley floodplain, perhaps? And obviously this is something which is very live, and it won't just be in the Northwich area that it's relevant by any means. Gemma, are you able to join us and perhaps provide a bit of advice and a steer in relation to that kind of longer term planning?
Yes, happy to. Hi everybody, I'm Gemma Davis. I'm the Director for Economy and Housing and Planning at the Council. So the assessment of flood risk is fundamental to the preparation of local plans and when determining planning applications. Development is assessed to ensure that inappropriate development in areas at risk of flooding is avoided by directing development away from areas at highest risk and factoring in the impacts of climate change. The Environment Agency and the Council, as the lead local flood authority, have a key role to play in inputting to decisions on schemes where flooding is a consideration and a risk, and they can raise objections to development where we feel that the impacts of flooding cannot be suitably mitigated against. In the question, turning to the specific reference to the residential development at Dane Valley, so the majority of the site being developed for housing is in what we call flood zone 1. So that's the zone at the lowest risk of flooding, with some development taking place in flood zone 2, medium probability of flooding. No development is taking place in land considered to have a high probability of flooding or in functional floodplain. Flood risk was a detailed consideration of all the applications submitted for this site, and a detailed and comprehensive drainage strategy was submitted and approved. The Environment Agency were involved in that as well. So to conclude the answer to the question, the Council, as the lead local planning authority, remains very committed to ensuring that national and local policies in relation to flood risk are being followed. And we've refreshed and reinforced this actually, and these requirements, really emphasising the importance of them and refreshing members of the planning team as a direct result of these recent events.
Thank you, Gemma. So that's going to be a really important issue going forward, and as we review the local plan in particular, will be something we need to take real cognizance of as we progress that work and engage with communities to ensure that we really understand the implications on the ground. We've got a couple of questions that are coming actually during the course of the session. from people who feel that they've perhaps not really been included and have been a bit forgotten in this whole process. So there's a question from Acton Bridge Cruising Club asking why they haven't been consulted and engaged. We've got a question from residents in Williston as well, who I think suffered some of the consequences of this and feel that they haven't had a lot of engagement. And obviously these are people who potentially lost their homes and have had property damage, and it will take some time for them to recover. So I just wanted to maybe ask again, Sean, whether you're able to give some reassurance to those who perhaps haven't appeared on any of our lists, but who nevertheless are suffering in exactly the same way as those in the areas we have highlighted.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and certainly we want to hear from all those parties, everyone that has been affected by certainly those internal flooding impacts. We want to hear, and we want you to inform the investigation process so that we identify in a timely manner appropriate recommendations moving forward. In particular, in terms of Williston, I can personally say I've visited a resident in Williston who demonstrated to me the flooding impacts of her property. So we are aware of that location. That was on the list as well. So we've not named each and every individual property or road there, but there is data behind that table. So yeah, we shared the contact details earlier about how to keep in touch with us. Please do so, and we'll willingly come and talk to and engage with you. We don't want to leave anyone behind, certainly. Thanks, Shelley. Okay,
thanks, Sean. And we've got a couple of questions here about the whole Section 19 approach. The question really is, why has it taken so long to produce the Section 19 report from the 2019 floods? And can we give assurances around the time that it's going to take to produce the Section 19 reports into the most recent event?
Yeah, Charlie, can I attempt to answer that one? So I think that the first element is just to clarify that what we are undertaking as a council and alongside our risk management authorities, so David from Environment Agency and Sam and colleagues from United Utilities, we go over and above what the actual requirements of the Section 19s are. So just beyond, we do go into the flooding risks and the mechanisms. So that does take some time. We think that's really important to do those reports justice beyond the actual remit that we would be required to do ordinarily. So it has taken some time, and we do apologise certainly for the October 2019. It's taken longer than we would have desired. Clearly, COVID has impacted somewhat on our ability to progress that during that time, and we did publish an interim report at the back end of 2020. And I'll just reassure you that the papers for Cabinet are produced now and will be made public next week, advance of the 17th of March. So we'll get that one released as early as possible. Just looking forward to the new investigation. And again, just recognising the frustration there. We will certainly expedite that process a lot quicker. We've got a lot of the background information now clearly. And in the slides there, we indicated a 3 to 4 month timescale for issuing the interim report, and we will certainly stick to that. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Sean. We've got time just for probably just a couple more questions. We've got a number of questions that have come in tonight and previously around our approach to maintaining and managing drains and gullies. So questions from right the way across the borough, actually, particularly in respect of flooding of highways, closure of roads, and also obviously flooding of property. And the question really is, why don't we clean and drain the drains and gullies more regularly, and what are we going to do to ensure that we put a more proactive regime in place, particularly in those areas that we know have been affected most recently?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Again, I'll attempt to answer this one. I think I'll deal with the latter point first in terms of those 15 plus sort of areas that we know suffered internal flooding across the borough. As part of the investigation, what we will do is not just survey those systems and connections, we will cleanse them as part of that investigation process. as well, so they will get a sort of a full system cleanse. I think I'll go on to the gully cleansing regime and frequency in a second, but I think it is just important to recognise that the gullies go somewhere, and eventually they go into other assets, maybe United Utility System, or eventually into a watercourse. And when you look at the severity of the Storm Christoph event that we've just experienced in January, it might seem a simple matter that it's maybe the gullies that are the issue, but often the case in those very extreme events is the water just can't get into its eventual watercourse where it needs to get to, and it just holds in the pipes and systems and in the gullies, and it looks as though the gully's not functioning. It's not the gully a lot of the time. It's the combined system beyond that from a highway drain. But in terms of the frequency of gully cleansing, so what we're currently doing is a sort of risk-based approach. So what we do as we cleanse gullies, we also record the silt levels in them, because what we want to do is empty the gullies that have silt build up more frequently, and the gullies that actually don't build up with silt, and a lot of the gullies are self-cleansing in a degree and a lesser risk. Well, we don't want to cleanse them maybe every year, and they can go on to a 2, 3, 4 year cycle, but the ones that are silting up or being obstructed through leaf fall or whatever it be, we need to cleanse them 2, 3, 4 times a year. So that's the sort of risk-based approach that we're developing at the moment. We need to do better. I think genuinely we'll hold our hands up where we've not quite got that right. But we need to use the systems intelligently and invest that money wisely as well. So it's an area that's certainly close to my heart to get right. I'll just give you that assurance. We will do that moving forwards. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Sean. I'm conscious that we haven't heard in this part of the session, at least from United Utilities, and we've had a number of questions in around the Northwich Town Centre issues in particular, and the adequacy of the drainage systems, the pumping systems, etc. Asking really kind of when are we going to thoroughly review all of that and do what we need to do to make the investment to improve capacity and ensure that we prevent and mitigate these situations from rising in the future. I wonder whether, Samantha, you'd be able to just give us a bit of a steer on that one.
Yeah, of course. So I guess in terms of a review of the sewer network and the drainage capacity in the Northwich Town Centre, we do that after every event. And I guess I wanted to almost reaffirm what Sean was saying before in terms of the actual free discharge, because that can be kind of the major impact on flooding rather than the capacity itself. So for our sewer network in the town centre of Northwich, so that's along High Street, that's along London Road, the capacity of the sewer network is actually able to deal with kind of storm returns of up to 1 in 100-year storm events. However, when the river levels are so high that the sewer network cannot actually discharge during that storm event, that is what happens. That's what causes the system to back up. So I guess it's something that we take very seriously, and we review following every storm event the kind of the nature of that flood mechanism, whether it's due to an operational cause, whether it's due to hydraulic capacity, or in these instances whether it's due to the inability to discharge due to the elevated river levels. So again, it's something that we take very seriously, and we will review as part of the Section 19 process going forward. But I can assure the residents in the town centre that the capacity in the town centre is actually fit for purpose for dealing with the storm return periods that we've experienced during Storm Christoph.
Okay, so more to come off the back of the Section 19 review. I am conscious of time now, and I'm afraid we have run out of time for questions. We had an enormous number of questions asked before the event and during the course of the last hour or so. I hope you feel as if we managed to get to some of the key issues, at least, that have been raised. And we will, as I said at the beginning, commit to making sure that we respond to all the questions that we've received. And if we receive further questions over the next week or so, we will respond to those as well. And as I say, we will send out copies of the slides that have been presented to you tonight. Can I thank all the panel members for your involvement in both the presentations and the question and answer session. I'd like to hand over now to Councillor Karen Shaw, who's going to make a few closing remarks. But from me, certainly, thank you all for participating tonight. I know we have had a good audience, and there are a lot of really important and interesting questions that we now need to go away with our partners and address. But I'll hand over now to Councillor Shaw.
Thanks, Charlie. And that, as you say, that does bring tonight to a close. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone for attending, including everyone watching online, but importantly to everyone who has supported the flood response and recovery effort. And as we've heard, the scale of disruption was unprecedented locally, and to have had to deal with that on top and in the midst of a global pandemic really shouldn't be underestimated. Just a very quick personal reflection. The leader and I visited residents in particular affected at Acton Bridge, and we also visited Northwich. And I want to give a shout out as well to the head teacher and the staff at Witton Church Walk Primary, who on top of having had to deal with the challenges of the pandemic, were also then flooded out of their building and had to decant the school building too. So big shout out to them too on a personal level. We've had a number of questions sent to us and some that you've heard answers to tonight, but I would also like to reiterate the commitment that Charlie has made at the start, that all questions will receive a response as soon as possible. And tonight is not a full stop on our engagement with you. In fact, the engagement will continue. It will continue directly with affected residents and businesses, and I'd like to reiterate again what we heard Sean Traynor say earlier. If you want to get in touch with us and you feel you'd like to continue that dialogue, then please do at the contact details that have been shared. We also want to continue to engage with communities more broadly as the recovery develops, and we also want to welcome all contributions to the Section 19 review process over the coming months. So once again, thank you for joining us this evening, everybody, and do stay safe. Good night.